Hey, how are you guys doing? Hopefully everybody's fine. Unfortunately, I can't be here with you today, but I will talk about the airline industry anyway, especially about the economic effect of the deregulation phase and how this impacted the modern airline business. Uh, Before the regulation was passed, the airline industry was in its early phase, and the first players were believed to work very destructively to undercut pricing, and because of that, policymakers believed that this industry had a uh, very large tendency towards a monopole, and because the industry was of public interest due to the large contribution to the whole economy and due to the contribution to other businesses which needed fast connections to cities throughout the country. Policymakers decided to establish the Civil Aeronautics Board through the Civil Aeronautics Act. The Civil Aeronautics Board was responsible to provide regulations and support in order to achieve a stable growth uh, in the whole industry, which basically means they were responsible for three major parts. First of all, they decided for entries. They decided whether airlines could enter the business. They decided whether airlines had to stay out of the business. And on the route level, they decided what airlines were allowed to fly, which route, which connections, and all of that. Additionally, which was also important, they decided for the price. They decided what would a flight from New York to Chicago cost, and the airlines weren't allowed to charge anything else. And an additional part was the antitrust, so they controlled any kind of issues concerning that. What implications did the cap have? So, so to say, they were the only one decision maker within the whole industry. They controlled the whole supply side. As I said, they decided who was in the business and who was not. And because of that, airline industry and the businesses and especially the managers were not allowed to apply any economics. The only way airlines could adjust profitability was through their cost structure. I mean, the CAB did provide them with information concerning pricing, and they could adjust by trying to save some money on the cost side. But this was kind of limited as well because they were not able to withdraw from any difficult routes. Um, but we have to say that due to the fact that the CAB worked in public interest and that they supported the airlines as much as possible, they tried to ensure profitability, and it also kept competition really low. There is this example that they did not accept any new application from 1950 to 1974 out of 79 applications. So additionally, you have to say that the number of carriers decreased from 16 in 1938 to 10 in 1978. So that means airlines, they hadn't a really large decision-making power, but they didn't have large competition either. So it kind of worked out for them initially. From economic point of view, the cap took away all the principles of supply and demand, which were applied before the regulations. They took away the factor that the market would determine pricing, and they took away all the implications of how a price would influence the demand. So, since they set the price, only the customers were only able to decide, okay, do I take do I take the price and I agree with them, or I just don't fly. Furthermore, other non-price determinants like the cost structure and technology changes and substitutes were also uh, considered by the cab, and it wasn't necessary for the airlines to think about that too much. So that was the main reason why the cab was introduced. And additionally, as I said, the market forces were suspended. Cab decided for prices, competition, and routes. They were a total regulator, and because of that, it has to be doubted whether airlines did strive for efficiency and innovations during that time. And some people would argue that in the beginning it was important to have the cab providing those regulations, but as the time went on, airlines grew into kind of self-working businesses, and after some time, people believed that they were able to work on themselves. However, you still have to remember the goal of the cab, and they were not in the responsibility to grow profits as much as possible, but they were responsible to grow the whole industry in order to serve the country. So after some time, a lot of different people would start think about the implications of the cab on the free market, and people believed that the cab wasn't needed anymore. So they thought that the cab rather hampered competition and that they kept the prices artificially high, which has the result for the consumer that they paid higher prices for flights. Additionally, you have to say that the cab was very bureaucratic and a very political organization, and their processes were very time consuming. And a funny example is the application of an American airline for a certain route, and it took the cab 8 years to provide them with the permission to fly on that specific route. So, in a nutshell, the rationales for the deregulation were that the cab uh, eventually did hamper innovation, competition, and efficiency, which resulted in the airlines losing track on the customer needs and airlines spending a lot of effort lobbying the cab for additional routes and higher fares and any other incentives. The result eventually was the Deregulation Act of 1978, and the main objectives of this act were the elimination of the cab and the dismissal of all regulation concerning fares, competition, and access. That means new airlines were able to access the market at will during that time. Old and new airlines were able to decide for any pricing, and all of the airlines in the market were able to decide on what routes they wanted to fly. So airlines were able to decide their network again. The result of deregulation on airline managers were very many. So airline managers basically had to think about in economic terms again. So they had to consider supply and demand curves. They had to calculate price elasticities. They had to make strategic decisions on what routes they wanted to be in, where to fly, where not to fly, where to withdraw. So different strategic decisions uh, had to be made again. Additionally, they had to develop pricing strategies, how to price different seats in a plane. They had to find ways to fill up the planes because it is a really high cost factor to buy a plane and to operate it. They had to think about profitability, how to stay profitable. And because a lot of new airlines entered the market, they had to think about how to compete against all our other airlines in the business. So result was a kind of a differentiation, and they of course considered all the economics, and they created sophisticated pricing strategies, which we'll hear afterwards. They put a very tight cost control and yield management into place. Additionally, they did strive for economies of scale, which is the concept where the average total cost would decrease by adding additional numbers of output. So this was possible through a larger negotiation power when buying plenty of planes, negotiation power towards airports, negotiation power towards employees and unions, uh, general general increase in efficiency within a larger network, and a better utilization of the expensive equipment. An interesting point is that they did change from point-to-point connection uh, between the cities to a so-called hub-spoke system, where one hub would be the main home base of one airline, and they just fly the passengers into the hub and then distribute it to the other cities. So this was a huge efficiency improvement for the airlines, and additionally for some passengers it was also of advantage because they gained a large number of connections. Some passengers were implicated negatively because they lost direct connections to some cities. For the businesses, we can say that they felt the necessity of cost cuts. They felt increased profit volatility. A lot of mergers happened within the marketplace. A lot of bankruptcies happened as well. And for the whole economy, it was bad because there were a lot of job losses during that time. However, we can say that there was a tremendous increase in competition, and after 7 years, new entries already had 70% of the market shares. And this was because they were innovative, smart, and lean. And this resulted in a situation where all carriers had to reinvent themselves. Some figures of that time, so the carriers increased from 36 to 120. The market share of the top 5 was distributed through to a larger number, and the carriers per route increased by roughly 30%. So how can we explain that? We just should think about this economic model. It states that a profitable market would attract new entries, and if they enter, the supply curve shifts to the right, which decreases the price, and only some firms would be able to stand the pressure on the profitability. So that means some firms would leave again, and in the end, only those firms would stay in the markets who were able to stand that high pressure. So this means an adjustment in the long run. As for the industry structure, we can say that the airline industry did transform from a strong oligopoly before the regulations into a quasi-monopoly during the time of the regulation, because the cab decided for everything, and nowadays the airline industry is a nearly perfect competition since it is nearly fully transparent. They have kind of identical products. The purchasing costs very low, but the entry barriers are still high. It's capital intensive. For the consumers, we felt a lot of positive effects. For example, the CPI adjusted decrease in fares was 40% until 96. Now it's kind of increasing again a little bit. We felt a lot of service improvements. They did differentiate their service, but we did struggle with some hub connectivities. For the whole industry, It was a difficult situation because they felt a lot of pressure and a tense profitability situation, but those companies who remain in the market, they did strive as well. So the number of turbojets increased and the revenue soared from 2.2 billion roughly to 195 billion 2 years ago. So they invented sophisticated pricing and cost control strategies, which we'll hear afterward, and they established demand estimation systems, and additionally, very important, they brought in technology to support the customer experience. Thank you. So now I will hand over to my colleagues and I wish you a pleasant time.